Okay, so here we go. Yeah. So this, I think we touched on last time. We've got two sets of Mishnayot that contradict each other a little bit. And so I want to see what you all think about that. And how do we resolve this conflict? Or maybe there is no resolution to the conflict. In this Mishnah Berachot, chapter 9, Mishnah 3, we've got one who has built a new house or bought a new vessel says, thank you, God, for bringing us to this important time, this important milestone. And then what we spent a lot of time last week talking about is one blesses over the bad as he blesses over the good, and blesses over the good as the bad. We'll set that aside for a minute. But the first half of 9.3 seems to be about thanking God for what happened in the past. And then the next part says, when you pray for the future, be careful about praying for the future. You can pray, but if you're praying about something that's already happened, that's a vain prayer. So you can pray looking forward for something that hasn't happened yet, like please let my family be healthy. But if someone is already sick, or if the siren's going off and you don't know whether it's your family or somebody else, it's the worst thing to pray and say, oh, it shouldn't be my family, because God isn't like Merlin or some magician who waves the wand and says, okay, I'm going to cause something that's already happened to change. You know, we don't have time travel here. So I'm struck by, maybe you don't think it's a contradiction, but I think there's a little bit of a tension, at least, between saying, thank you, God, for what happened in the past, and now here saying, we don't cry out about the past. Is that, and okay, you can say one is thanks and one is request, but I have a hard time, okay, and I'm going to give you a couple of Mishnayot that pose this very directly. Here's Rabbi Nehunya ben Hakana, and hu haya mitpalel beknisato lebeit hamidrash uvitziato tefillah ktsara. He used to pray when he went into the Beit HaMidrash, the study house, and when he came out, short prayer. They said, where does this, what's the reason for this? He said, when I enter, I pray that no mishap should occur through me, and when I leave, I express thanks for my portion. And actually in the Gemara, it tells us what exactly he prayed, and I don't want to dwell on that too much. The key here is that he prays going in, saying, I hope that nothing bad happens. And no mishap, I think what he's referring to is, I hope that I don't make a mistake when I'm teaching what the law is. If I teach it wrong, then God forbid, people are going to treat pure things as impure and impure as pure, and that would be terrible. I would cause other people to be violating mitzvot. And when I leave, I express thanks for my portion, that I am privileged to spend so much time studying Torah. He is both looking forward and looking backward. This next one, I think, is even more interesting. When one comes into a large city, hanichnas lekrach, mitpalel shtayim, prays twice, once when he goes in and once when he goes out. Ben Azai Omer, arba, 2 times when he goes in, or 2 blessings when he goes in and 2 when he goes out. He gives thanks for the past and cries out for the future to come. So this really, I guess, would answer my question. We don't really know what the 2 prayers are when you go in, but you could imagine something like when you go in saying, I'm going into this big dangerous city, I hope nothing bad happens to me there. And then when you come out, you say, thank you for not letting anything bad happen to me, or just I'm grateful that I had a safe trip. Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's I'm coming home to the city. I love it here. You know, if I can make it here, I'll make it anywhere. Thank goodness I'm back. And then when you go out again, you say, well, now I'm going out into the scary world. Sarah.
So I was thinking that the for prayer scenario, you know, anytime you cross a liminal space, it's dangerous, right? In many religions. So you might, upon reaching the gate of the city, say, you know, the Shehakian for getting you to the gate, and then pray, you know, a petition to let things go well while you're there. And then the reverse order when you leave. Thank you for letting things go well. Cross out of the gate and say, let things go well that I might reach home safely.
Exactly. And here you have exactly what you've described. This is the Talmud commenting on this little Mishnah here. And it tells us what these four prayers would be. When you go in, may it be your will, O Lord our God, to bring me into this city in peace. And I thank you, O Lord my God, that you have brought me into the city in peace. When you're about to leave, you say, may it be your will to bring me out of the city in peace. And after exiting, I thank you, Lord my God, that you have brought me out of the city in peace. And just as I came out in peace this time, so in the future, etc. Deliver me from the hands of all enemies. So yeah, so this is, I think, exactly what you're talking about. And this is literally the liminal space. It's like the gate of the city when you're about to cross through it, and then when you got to the other side of it. Shoshana, you were about to comment? Oh, you're on mute. I can't hear you.
Hi. I don't know. Could it be some kind of separation between personal prayer and community prayer? So the personal, the community prayer is when the person sets up a home and now is part of a community, so he's praying to God. But clearly, if you're asking for a child, well, that's kind of a, nowadays we think pretty sort of okay to do. A male child, or shelter me when I go into the city. It's more personal. Am I making sense? I see a separation between the two kinds of brachot.
Totally. And I feel kind of uncomfortable with the way people handle the Mishnah Berachot for the sick during a lot of services where, well, I'll turn that around. When you say, let me be healthy, or let my loved one be healthy, it's, or you name the person who you're praying for, and it makes me a little uncomfortable because God is not, you don't sort of put in a prayer and ask for a result to come out. It's obnoxious to assume that you can influence how God runs the universe. On the other hand, pray collectively for health, you know, to pray for an end to the pandemic, for example, or to just pray generally that that our people get healthier and not sicker overall. That strikes me as less of a problem than the sort of individual, you know, may it be your will that I get an A on this exam kind of thing. So I think that's a really suggestion. So
can I follow up on that, David?
Yeah, go ahead.
Do we have authority on the Mishnah Berachot and the custom of asking for the well-being of people that we are well favored to? I mean, we have it as our minhag to do it, and I understand the point you just made. It's interesting, but I wonder if we have authority about the appropriateness of that generally.
I don't know. Like, well, I think we do have the expectation that, for example, the Amidah is a personal prayer to God about the things that you care about, you know, and it might be something like, help me be a better person. This is why I like Debbie Friedman's formulation where she says, give us strength to, or courage to face what's ahead of us. Bless us with healing. Without specifying, healing might just be fortitude or courage to be able to face a terrible disease, not necessarily, you know, may I have, you know, this number of T cells or something like that. So, but I'm not sure I could point to a specific source to say yes or no.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, oh, sorry, David. Maybe something with like Miriam when she got leprosy and didn't like people like bless her, or, you know, whatever. She got the leprosy and then we asked for healing. Didn't Moshe ask for her healing?
Right, right. And that, the prayer that he prayed is often used as a model, and sort of using the Debbie Friedman song. There's this song, El Na Rifana La, which is the prayer that Moses used. So yeah, and that was much more of a personal, my sister is sick, please God heal her, let her not wither up and die. There's got to be a place for that, because if you're thinking about prayer as a form of communication and you have a connection to God, then you gotta be honest about what you're hoping for and what you want, what you hope is going to happen, even if you don't think that there's going to be a cause and effect, that because I said this prayer or because I did this good deed, therefore God is going to favor me. In a way, you're pleading for mercy. You say, well, I don't deserve it, and nothing I say is going to change it, but I sure hope that that there's a good result coming out of this. It's an interesting contradiction, and
maybe the reasonableness points to the high holidays and their substance. I don't know.
Yeah.
Can't hurt, might help.
Yeah. But wasn't originally the purpose of prayer, like going back even to the good old idol days, is you had an idol and you pray to them to give you rain and a crop and keep your family well. So I think the idea of all of that idea of prayer and everything, you know, came into Judaism when it lived in, you know, between the Tigris and whatever else river, and it absorbed all the cultural aspects of other cultures. It took on that notion that God can be personalized. And we talk about a personal God, don't we? We all want to have a personal relationship with God. I don't want a, you know, Pope to tell me about my relationship with God. I want it to be me and God, not me and a whole bunch of archbishops and then the Pope.
Right. Well, listen, that's not just a Canaanite or Babylonian kind of idolatry. It's also, there's a lot of Jewish sources for it. Like there's this whole tradition of, you know, if it doesn't rain and your crops are drying up, to fast and pull out your hair and fall on your face. I mean, there are descriptions of all these things, and the Tanaim were very interested in this. I think people might be less inclined to do that today, although there was a demonstration where people were fasting on the fast of Esther right before Purim about bringing an end to this war in Ukraine. So maybe there's still this idea that if you fast and if you call on God for help, that God is going to help you.
Also, the lines leading up to the principal line of the Shema basically speak to this as well, right? That if you don't want to have a calamity come to your plan, then you should have faith in the one God, right? I mean, that's certainly a central prayer in our liturgy.
Absolutely, and that's sort of where we begin this whole class, and a lot of this whole section of the Mishnah Berachot, is taking that paragraph or those paragraphs of the Bible and saying, well, what does it mean? What does it mean to say you shall speak of them when you rise up? Okay, let's spell it out. What time are you is when you rise up, and then more spiritually, what do you mean when you say speak of them? Speak what? Speak out loud, speak in Hebrew, or is it speaking the specific sentences in the right order, or is there some kind of something that's going on in your mind and in your spirit that you're actually speaking of them? And there's that second paragraph of the Shema, which says, if you listen to what I tell you, and if you follow the mitzvot, then good things are going to happen, and you're going to, the rain is going to fall at the right time, and your animals will be healthy. And if not, everything is going to go terribly. And that, you could say, well, okay, so we've got a little cause and effect going on where my good behavior causes God to bring me good outcomes, and if not. I interpret that as saying it's maybe it's a little more descriptive. It's if you live right, then you're going to live in a contented way, and you're going to live in a prosperous way, because you're going to be able to live in a productive and happy way if you follow God's precepts and act in a way that loves others, and you build a just society and so on. And if you don't, then it's going to be disaster, you know. And you could also put an environmental spin on it and say, if you waste your resources, and if you destroy things for nothing, and if you mess up the earth, it's going to be a disaster. And that makes it a little bit more descriptive as opposed to a cause and effect. But it doesn't take away the need to call out and express yourself and talk to God. So what does it mean? It's one thing to be thankful and say the Shechianu, and it's another thing to say, please God, heal my sister. And yet the core prayer, like the Amidah, has both of those ideas in it, right next to each other, right, butting up next to each other. So I look at this last Mishnah as maybe a little bit of a resolution to this, which is these rabbis are saying, even if you pray and you hope for a good outcome, and you do all the mitzvot, and you study Torah, and the Romans still come and they destroy you, and they evict you from your land, burn down your temple. So the idea is here, at least one way of reading it is, you bless God for the evil, for what happened that was not good, in the same way that you bless for the good. And they're going to the Shema here. So this is a whole little midrash here. Lest you think that the Mishnah is all technical and legal, it's got midrash in it, and here is one. B'chol levavcha. They say, well, that means there are two vets here, even though the word heart, you could say lev. It doesn't have to be levav. So why levav instead of lev? With your two inclinations, with your good inclination and with your bad inclination. And this is much older than the sort of Kabbalistic idea of the Yetzer Hara. But it does mean your inclination to do bad things can be something that pulls into your heart. In other words, your heart, or the seat of your intelligence and your thought and your super ego, or your ego. There are good aspects and bad aspects, and you want to harness the whole thing towards loving God. Uvechol nafshecha, with all of your soul, afilu hu notelet nafshecha. This is the classic text for martyrdom. With all of your soul, with all of your life, meaning you're devoting your whole life to God. Even if God takes your life, you still love God. Wow, that's a heavy one. And then uv'chol modecha, that means with all of your money, v'chol mamoncha. And here we're going to see a little pun in the Hebrew. The Bible says v'chol me'odecha, and they're going to take that sound and say davar acher. One explanation: v'chol me'odecha, v'chol midah umidah shehu moded lecha. So they're saying me'od, and they're turning it to midah umidah, with every measure and measure that God measures out to you, or with every. And the idea here is, of course, they're using this pun to make a point, which is whether God measures out good or God measures out bad, whatever the outcome is, you're going to try to keep your focus on where it should be. Here's another pen. Heve modeh lo bim'od me'od. It helps to have a little Hebrew here. Modeh means thanks. So we're getting three puns here. V'chol midah umidah shehu moded lecha heve modeh lo. Be thankful to God b'mod me'od. Very, very much. So it's a little midrash that has a kick to it. I'm also thinking about this and sort of the beginning of trying to figure this out. At the conclusions of blessings back in the time of the first temple, they would say forever, which would be min ha'olam. And when the sectarians came along, sectarians being possibly the Pharisees, or I'm sorry, the Sadducees, maybe even the Christians, when they came along and they perverted their ways, or they started dissenting from things that the mainline Jewish leaders thought were appropriate, and they said, "Ein olam ela echad." There's only one world. So what does it mean there's only one world? They're denying the idea of a world to come. And that is considered heresy to the Tanaim. And so they're saying, no, there's got to be this world and the world to come. The Minim said, Ein olam ela echad. There's no world except one. The Hikinu sheyihu omrin min ha'olam ve'ad ha'olam. So you're going to see this passage. It's sort of an expanded version of Amen, from the world to the world, forever and ever. So using that word olam twice. And the implication, as I see it, is maybe your prayer does not have the effect of changing the outcome in this world, but maybe it gets you to that point in the next world. Or maybe with the idea of reward and punishment, God is going to reward you. God is going to bring good results to the people who deserve it, and the opposite to those who don't. But you're not going to see it in this world, so you're going to have to look for it in the next world. And I don't know. I'm thinking about this, and now I'm thinking about, you know, this Ben Azai going into the city and going out of the city, and then going into the city again, going up to the wall and passing over and going to the other side. That there's also this idea of being thankful for what happened and hopeful about anticipating the future. And I'm fiddling with the idea of the world of saying thank you versus the world of saying please let it happen, and what the rabbis would have called olam hazeh, this world, and olam haba, the next world. Just want to see if anyone has any comments or thoughts about that.
I guess my question is there any discussion in Chumash about Olam Haba? Is there ever, I can't recall any like total reference to Olam Haba. So it's got to be more of a contemporary notion within the rabbis, and were they influenced by some other cultures out there with that kind of idea?
That's a great point. And I think they would say, if you don't see it in the Chumash, then you haven't really read it that carefully. Sarah's holding up all the places where it says this. Well, go ahead. What do you want? Let's hear it.
That is actually true. So I'm a physics person, and the notion that olam can mean space or time was, more than I could pass up. So I checked in the concordance and went through the whole Tanakh and tagged where the words olam haba were mentioned. And as you can see, there are plenty.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
I mean, most of it's in Nach, but there's some in the Torah as well. Plenty.
Give us an example. Where's the first place it shows up?
Okay. I am in Genesis 3. Well, it's just leolam. Actually, the word I looked up was leolam, meaning whether it was going to be time or space. But when you get into the prophetic, it's leolam haba. And so this means time. It's forever.
Right.
You're going to live. If you don't eat from the tree, you're going to live forever.
Ah, right. Of course, forever. Leolam.
So, right from the bang, the word olam, meaning time and space, that fuzzy, Einsteinian confluence is there.
Right. So you got from the world to the world, but of course, they did eat from the tree, and they didn't live forever. So that was a little bit of a threat that God threatened but didn't really carry out, I guess, or a threat or a promise. I don't know.
No, he said if you don't eat from the tree, you'll live forever. They ate, and now we die. It introduced death.
Right. Yeah, I guess I was being a little more literal with, having, reading the Chumash, and right now I'm in the process of studying Kings. There's never a time where, like, when Moshe died, when he's about to die, God says, don't worry, you're coming to see me in Olam Haba. I don't think there's any, unless I'm wrong, of course, any sort of direct notion of that there's another world.
Well, I think that's true if you read it explicitly, but the Tanaim would probably say, oh, you're one of these sectarians or heretics, because we see it all over the place. And just let me show you this verse and that verse and the other verse. That'll be the next class.
And I'm sure, like, if you read the Zohar and, other texts in Kabbalah, they would discuss it over and over. But I'm saying directly in just the Chumash itself, I don't ever remember anybody saying, like, don't worry, you're going to have a better place in the world to come, or you're about to die and you're going to have, like, a fun time in the next world.
Right, and you've also even got the opposite of that, where, like, in the Hallel, it says, those who go down into the grave don't praise God, but we are alive and we're going to praise you. So that would seem to imply that there's one world. Anyway, but I connect this back to what are we praying about anyway? And the Tanaim definitely saw this from the point of view of there is a future world. There's this world and there's a future world, and that's part of what you're praying for. That was how they saw the world. So now that we've wrapped that up, we all understand it. Jerry, please go ahead.
I respond to Sarah a little bit. I'm looking at the Eitz Chaim Tanakh and Chumash, and it's using the JPS translation, and what they have for their English translation, when the serpent says, "You shall not eat of it," God said, "You shall not eat of it or touch it, lest you die." So the indication there is it'll poison you, you'll die. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah. Which, by the way, one comment about that, which is whenever you study the Mishnah or the Talmud or any of these sources, always bring a copy of the Bible with you. Have it right on your left hand, because there's always going to be something where they say, oh yeah, what does the Bible say about that? Or what's your source for that? Oh, well, it's over here in Exodus chapter 25 or whatever.
I mean, clearly one can interpret different ways. I'm not saying you can't. But the way it
Oh yeah. Well, we saw that from the beginning of this class, where you have when you lie down and you rise up, and does that mean your posture, or does that mean a time of day? It could be either one. We've gone with the idea that it's about time of day and not posture, but it could have gone a different way. They're not inherently wrong.
Right.
All right, well, let's go with a less controversial issue. Women, slaves, and minors. Nashim ve'avadim uktanim p'turin mi kriyat Shema. They're exempt from reciting the Shema and tefillin. The chayavin, and they're obligated b'tfilah, which is the Amidah, b'mzuzah, v'virkat hamazon, and the blessing after meals. All right, so let me read it again. Women, slaves, and minors are exempt from the Shema and putting on tefillin, but are obligated for the Amidah, mezuzah, and the Birkat Hamazon. What do you think? Initial reactions. Have people seen this line before?
Yes.
Well, yeah, clearly the problem is women are not obligated to say any mitzvot that are time bound. So with the Shema, you've got a time element with the Shema, like morning at night. So they don't put on tefillin because, again, that's time bound. Mezuzah is just on your door, so it's any time, you don't have to deal with it. But the one that bothers me is a birchat hamazon, because you do eat at certain times of the day, so that's a time bound mitzvah.
But so is the Amidah. Well, let's get into this time-bound issue.
So is the Amidah, correct.
Let's get into the time-bound thing. So you're referring to this Mishnah of Kiddushin, which is the source of this idea of the time-bound. I'll skip the first paragraph and go right into the next paragraph. Kol mitzvah aseh shehazman gerama. Every positive commandment that applies only at a particular time, or that is triggered by a particular time, men are obligated and women are exempt. And every positive commandment that is not time limited, men and women are equally obligated. So first of all, what's a positive commandment and what's a negative commandment? Mitzvah aseh, a mitzvah of do it, and a mitzvah lo taseh, a mitzvah of don't do it. So this is sort of the thou shalt and the thou shalt not. For example, thou shalt not eat chametz on Pesach, or thou shalt eat matzah on Pesach. Two different things. And in general, the thou shalt nots, if there's a conflict between them, then don't do it. The thou shalt nots tend to be stricter and more critical than the thou shalts, although obviously, thou shalt rest and enjoy the Shabbat, thou shalt not work and do certain activities on Shabbat. A lot of times they go together, or the matzah and chametz example that I gave before. But they're basically, you can say this is a matrix with 4 boxes. There's the time bound and the non-time bound, and there's the positive and the negative. And women and men are equally obligated for all of the negative, and on the positive ones, they're obligated for those that are not time bound, and they are exempt where there's a specific time when you're supposed to keep the mitzvah. And then this Mishnah goes on and says, if it's a negative commandment, women are exempt from the negative commandment to trim their beard, or for a priest not to come. Now, so there are so many questions that come out of this. And one of the basic ones is, but wait a second, what are we talking about here? It doesn't make any sense. Let's come back to this. What about the Shema and the Amidah? They're both time bound. We wrote all these rules about what time in the morning. Well, you have to wait until you can tell the difference between the blue and the green. And there's a morning Amidah, and there's an afternoon Amidah, and there's an evening Amidah. So what? It's time bound, just like the Shema. They both have times, and for that matter, usually when we say the Shema, they're right next to each other. So what are we saying? That you can just sort of skip right over to the Amidah? Why wouldn't you say both of them? Sarah, and first Sarah, then Jared.
So you can actually say the Amidah, there are big windows of time for the Amidah. And I know that Berachot starts off with a big window of time for the Shema, but in the second Mishnah, there's actually a description of the most optimum moment in the morning to say the Amidah, to say the Shema, and that is you're connecting redemption with the actual sunrise, and so the timing of it is actually crucial if you want to be one of these extra religious people, which is just impossible if you're a woman raising children. You cannot plan on such a thing.
Yeah, but then one can say, what if you're a man raising children? Or what if you're a woman who is childless? Or what if you're a woman whose children are all grown and you're off the hook with that kind of thing? Yeah, I'm not saying that you're the first person who said this, because it's one of the many justifications that people have come up with. But in our day, it really doesn't make sense. But even in those days, well, wait a second, you're applying this to all women based on women who are raising children? Well, how does it work?
This is rabbinic law. We can change it.
Okay. But remember that reciting the Shema is in the Torah, whereas the Tefillah, the Amidah, is a rabbinic creation. Yes, but here we're exempting the women from a Torah law, but we're obligating them for a rabbinic law.
Right, exactly. Well, my point is that the exact timing of the Shema is rabbinic. All the Torah says is when you lie down and when you get up.
Right.
Which, of course, as you know, much ink was spilled on that as well.
Right. So now the real question, why would there be different rules for the Shema and the Amidah? Okay, we said that the Shema, you're actually reading passages from the Bible, but we also said if you're reading along in the Torah and you happen to come to the Shema, if you're not thinking about it in terms of addressing God and saying the Shema, then you haven't really said the Shema. So both the Amidah and the Shema have an aspect of trying to make that connection between the individual and God. So, but we saw this in a few other places. When they climb the tree, they're allowed to do the Amidah, but not the Shema. So what's the difference here? Why would the two be treated differently? And why would the answer be different for men and women? Aside from the technicality, okay, time bound, not time bound, but why? Ira.
So I don't have any source on this, except for Gidon, but I think that I've heard that in terms of development of the liturgy, there was maybe a contest or some kind of facing off between the Shema and the Amidah. At some point, one was considered more substantive than the other, or they either could have been had by themselves, and at some point it was decided to just include them both in the development of a liturgy. But I don't have a good history on that. It was just rumor. I don't know what we know. So it seems like you want to put this whole thing in time context, possibly. I'm not sure.
It's a historic development, in other words, and that could also be one of the sources that I read on this said this business about the time bound versus non-time bound. was developed as an explanation for what people were already doing, as opposed to a prescription for what people ought to do. And then it got written up in this Mishnah that we just read from Kiddushin, and then people took that and went to town later and said, no, that's a prescription. That's how it ought to be, as opposed to just, we observe that this is how people are living. Shoshana.
My first question is, clearly the slaves indicated in here had to be Jewish slaves, number one. Number two, to me, it makes more sense because the Shema is basically 3 paragraphs. And after, I think, grade 2 or 3 of Talmud Torah, you know the Shema pretty well off by heart. The other thing with the Amidah, I can recite it along somebody else, but on my own, I couldn't recite the whole thing off by heart, and I've been saying it for multi years. But with the Amidah, isn't there the reason for a repetition of the Amidah is one, women weren't literate, so they wouldn't have known the whole Amidah off to read, number one. They weren't there often enough to learn it off by heart by going to shul regularly. So from what I understood, the repetition of the Amidah is for all of those people who can't do the reading, they still at least hear it.
Yeah, but that would include women and men. And this is also in a time when people didn't have printed Sidurim.
Yeah.
Or maybe they couldn't read, I don't know. Sarah.
Yeah. So I'm sort of sitting here with the irony that Amidah is required of women, and yet the model for the Amidah are the 3 avot making prayers at different times in the day. So the model is a man praying in solitude, actually. And yet women are obligated to do that as well. So I find that ironic.
Well, if you look in the Bible, actually, speaking of the Book of Kings, scroll back to the Book of Samuel. One of the very first examples and models of people praying is Hannah, right? Praying for a child, and eventually she gives birth, and it's Samuel. And in the Talmud of Berachot, there's a lot of discussion about how a lot of what we learn about in terms of how to pray comes from that whole passage of how Hannah prayed. So let me take you through a few more of these sources. Going back to this distinction between the time-bound and the non-time bound, there's a Baraita that comes along. This is a teaching from the period of the Tanaim that was not included in the Mishnah, but we still remember it and we bring it back here. So which positive commandments are we talking about that apply only at a particular time? In other words, what falls into that category? Well, sukkah, lulav, shofar, tzitzit, and tefillin. And by the way, if you think, the Amidah or the Shema could be recited at a certain time of day, you got a whole week to sit in a sukkah, right? And you could shake lulav any time of the day. Now, tzitzit, you don't wear them at night, but you do wear them in the daytime. They're all related to time. They are triggered by a particular time. Which positive commandments are not time limited? Mezuzah, installing the parapet on the roof so people don't fall off, returning lost property, shooing the bird away from the nest. Which one are we leaving out here? But it's the greatest mitzvah of all. It's studying Torah, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. That's a non-time bound positive mitzvah, and yet women are not obligated according to the system of the Tanaim. And it turns out that once you start picking days apart and looking at the different individual mitzvot, some kind of doesn't really work that well. So, uklala, is this really a general principle? But matzah, rejoicing on festivals, and the 7th year assembly are all time-bound positive commandments, but women are obligated. And yet, study of the Torah, procreation, and redemption of the firstborn are positive commands, but not time-limited, and yet women are exempt. So you can set this out as a general principle, and then you can come up with a zillion examples of how it doesn't really work. Which I read an interesting, there's two views on this. One is that somebody came up with this sort of as a general principle, even though, okay, well, there are exceptions here and there, but they're trying to sort of develop a system to explain. In other words, it's not a prescription, it's a description, and we're sort of maybe you could take a scatter plot and say, well, everything doesn't fit within our distribution, but maybe within the bell curve. Those of you who are math or statistics or physics folks can straighten me out on this. The idea that most of the mitzvot as a general matter fit into this, even though we can think of plenty that don't. And then there's another thought, is that there are two streams of thought among the Tanaim, and some of them are going this direction and others are going that direction. And it's not just about this time-bound versus non-time-bound, it's how much should women be participating in Jewish ritual life. It's not that women don't have a connection to God or the obligation to have a connection to God. It's just that these ritual practices, for whatever reasons, and probably the reason was that women were in a subservient role in society when this was come up with, they said, well, we're not going to have women obligated to this. By the way, another question that comes up here is, just because you're not obligated to do something, are you allowed to do it? And the answer is usually, yeah, you're not obligated to do it, but you can do it, and it's a good thing if you do. But there's some people who read these as saying, if you're not obligated, then you shouldn't do it. And an example of this goes back to Rabban Gamliel, who we read in the first or second week, where they say you're not obligated to say the Shema if you're in mourning, if you're in the first week after the death of, let's say, your spouse, I think it was. And he says, well, that may be and then his students caught him saying the Shema and say, Rabbi, what are you doing? You said that they're not supposed to. And he says, well, but I'm special. I can't set aside committing myself to God for even once. Then his sons caught somebody else doing that, and they said, "What do you think? You're so religious, like our dad?" So it's not clear whether not obligated means not allowed, but I think in general, not obligated just means it's optional but not mandatory. But it's a little bit ambiguous, and again, different people have different answers. And even in the from black hat world, there are people who won't even let women study Torah because they say, well, they're not supposed to do it. It says they're not obligated. It's not a mitzvah for them to do it. Then you could say, well, maybe it's okay for them to do it, but we're not going to let them say a bracha, Asher Kichanu Mitzvotav, who commanded us. Sarah.
I have two responses. One is to the Rabban Gamliel story. There are other stories where rabbis choose a lenient interpretation because they say they're delicate. That is actually the word as it's translated. So the rabbis, they manipulate the law to suit their own purposes as well. The other thing I was thinking about is when you were saying about just because you're not obligated doesn't mean you can't do it in the season that we're in. It reminds me of that story where an Orthodox rabbi said a female rabbi is like an orange on the Seder plate, to which I always thought like, well, there's nothing.
No, it's a crust of bread.
Yeah, that orange is a misinterpretation of something from the first woman's Haggadah. It's not, yeah, I know what you're saying, Sarah, I know what you're saying.
It's not
an orange at all?
No,
That's a
the orange symbolizes, yeah,
first of all,
symbolizes something else.
Here's the story that I heard. First of all, application of the story as you remember it is exactly right here. So no criticism here. It makes complete sense. Just because an orange isn't commanded doesn't mean it's not permitted.
Exactly.
And just because it's not commanded doesn't mean you can't use it as a symbol that means something good. So the story it wasn't just about a female rabbi, it was about lesbians, gays and lesbians, but especially I think lesbians, and the idea that they made this early feminist Haggadah, and they say, why does Judaism say that, you know, having giving honor or being respectful to women who are lesbians is like bread on the Seder plate. It's like bringing bagels to your in-laws. And the response was, it's not like bread, it's like an orange. The bread is forbidden. The orange is, you're not used to seeing this, but get used to it because we can do this. So that gives it a little bit of a different spin. It's the same idea.
Nowadays, orange seems to be mandatory at a Seder. Every Seder I've been to the last few years, we always have an orange now.
Right, that's the power of minhag. And then you get to Seder and they don't have the orange, and you say, wait, you forgot something. Right?
Yeah, the tradition was started by Shoshana Herschel, Rabbi Herschel's daughter, to symbolize an orange in recognition of gay and lesbian Jews and others who are marginalized in the Jewish community. In her ritual, each person takes a segment of the orange and before eating it, says a blessing over the fruit. The seeds are then spit out in rejection of homophobia.
That's nice. I had not heard that tradition.
So I guess it wasn't a navel orange.
It started off as an orange, correct. Oh, navel orange. Oh, they
Yeah,
don't have
no-
seeds?
No seeds. It was a joke.
Okay.
Anyway, going back to this section of the Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan says, okay, we can't learn from these general principles, even where there are exceptions. There's just too many exceptions we can't learn. So taking this back to the Shema and the Amidah, we got, in addition to just understanding why it is, we've got another question here, which is, if we know that there's a general principle of women are exempt from the time-bound commandments, right? Then we've got two problems with this verse. One problem is that we're saying that they're obligated with the tefillah, which is a time-bound commandment. And even arguably Birkat Hamazon is time-bound because you're supposed to say it a certain period of time after you finish the meal. That's one problem. The second problem is if you think that there's a general rule coming out of this Mishnah Kiddushin that we read, then why do they even have to tell us about exempt from reciting the Shema? We ought to know that because we know that the Shema is a time-bound commandment. We know that women are exempt from time-bound. So what are you wasting my time for? The Mishnah does not like extra words. There's got to be a reason for why do we have to say this here? So, of course, I didn't come up with this question. And of course, people have talked about it before. And here's Rabbi Ovadia Mibartanyora, who is the sort of Mishnah equivalent of Rashi. And some of his material is original and a lot of it is taken from other sources, but brought together in a way that is very useful. So he's commenting on two separate sections of the Mishnah that we read. And I'll read the second one first. The Chayavim b'tfilah, they're obligated to the Amidah. But wait, why would you say that they're obligated in tefillah? Tefillah rachamehu. This is really interesting. Rachameh, like rachamim, it means a prayer for mercy or supplication, or it's this idea of pouring out your heart to God, that everybody has a relationship to God, men and women equally. Everybody has a spirit that needs to talk to God. And so therefore, even though the Amidah is a time-bound positive mitzvah, it's something that you can't keep people away from, and it's really obligatory because it's about this, making this connection to God, and every Jew, male or female, has this. And then you could also say, well, also, Sarah sort of hinted at this before, it's a rabbinic commandment as opposed to a biblical commandment. So you might say, well, it's a little easier to bend the rules when it comes to this one. We're not going to sort of apply the rubric quite. And they say also, they fixed it by requiring or permitting the women to say it, because women do most of the education of the minors, and if they're not praying the Amidah, how can they teach it to their kids? Okay. By the way, just to get back to the minors, going back to this Mishnah, does it outrage you like it outrages me that they're putting women together with slaves and children? I mean, seriously, women, slaves, and children? And in a way, it's even worse because slaves can be freed and children tend to grow up, but women, at least until very recently, we're going to be women no matter what.
Okay, where do you want to put this in the hierarchy of things? We've got soda, we've got the Amidah, and this thing. I mean, you know,
well,
it's a historical document in many ways, reflecting a mindset that, thank God, most of the people I come in contact with no longer have.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, I'm doing what I said I wouldn't do at the very beginning, which is we're having a class about what the Tanaim thought at a particular time and place in history, and just because we don't like it doesn't mean we can't understand or sort of burrow into the way they looked at the world. But okay, that's a little too cute, because really we are basing a lot of our religion on what these guys taught. So it is kind of important to say, well, how do we respect the Bible? How do we respect the Mishnah and still try to read what they wrote and figure out a way to make our peace with it? So,
well, my comment would be that well, women clearly were property at the same time as slaves and minors, correct? The men had control over them. But to justify a little aspect of Judaism being a little pro-women, I would say that any other religions wouldn't even have given women any kind of brachot or any kind of responsibility with the education of the children or learning certain things to be able to teach your children and be like, you know, being semi-learned. So Judaism has gone one little step forward, where at the time, I'm assuming all the other cultures were still way at the back of the line. So that's
absolutely.
my little plug for Judaism.
I think I will share that. I think that's a good one. So anyway, I interrupted Mr. Bartanura in the middle of his explanation here. So I read the second one first, which is they're obligated to the tefillah, which is the Amidah, because mostly it's a prayer for mercy. And this is a difference between the Amidah and the Shema, is that the Shema is reading a passage from the Bible, whereas the Amidah has more of an element of personal kavanah, personal intention and mindful directing yourself. Not that the Shema doesn't involve that, but the Amidah maybe a little more of it. So then jumping back up to the first one, well, since we know that women are exempt from all the positive time-bound commandments, why do we need to have this Mishnah at all? Why are you wasting our time telling us something we already knew? No, no, it is necessary, because you might think that because the Shema is about Malchut Shamayim, there should be an exception from the general rule, and that women should be obligated. So therefore, you need this Mishnah to come along and say, not that. Women really still are exempt from the Shema. This is a great example of Talmudic reasoning. right? The Talmudic reasoning is, why do we have a superfluous sentence here? Well, it's superfluous because you might have thought this, so this, you have to have this here, even though we already knew it, to make sure that that other concept is ruled out. So I have a few more recent sources. Well, I'll start with the Middle Ages here. Rabbi David Abu Draham. And his theory is sort of similar to, I'm not sure, one of you all came up with this one. The reason women were excused from the time-bound mitzvot was because a woman is subject to her husband to attend to his needs. If she were under obligation to carry out these mitzvot, it might happen that while performing one of them, her husband orders her to do his bidding. Were she then to persist in doing the mitzvah of the Creator and neglect her husband, woe to her on account of her husband. But were she to do his bidding and drop the mitzvah of her Creator, woe to her on account of her Creator. Therefore, the Creator excused her from the mitzvah so that she will have peace with her husband. And the only thing in this Hebrew that I'll point out to you is this word oi. Lest you think that oi is a recent word or merely an Ashkenazic word. It's he's a Sephardi and he's using oi too. And actually oi is in the Bible. So in case you were worried about oi, there's a good history to it. But his explanation has to do with the conflict, the fact that she's subject to her husband's domination, which doesn't completely answer the question because the same rules apply to women who aren't married. And you could say, well, if she's not married, she's probably still living with her father. But what about a widow or a divorcee? And it turns out that there are some rules that women living with their fathers or married women are not subject to, but they do apply to divorcees and widows for this reason, because they don't have some man around telling them what to do. They have responsibility and authority. So, but in any case, the general principle kind of falls apart, and especially nowadays. And the other theory that I didn't print here is about child rearing responsibilities. And again, it's the same thing. It's the same concept. Well, women are busy doing something else, following their husband's rules, running around after their kids. No. You just apply a little logic to it and it doesn't work. So, Jerry.
A quick thing. Both my grandfather, who was a Hasidic rabbi in Europe, and I were each, for 8 years, single parents, single fathers. So it's not only women who do the raising of children, but look at the negative ones. The negative ones, women are obligated for, but a man can tell his wife, do that. And then you have the same conflict.
Right, right. I suppose the idea is, I mean, he's a Jew. He's not going to say do something that's prohibited, but he might say, I need you to come and pull up my socks now. And she says, but it's the right moment to say the Shema. Well, just go pull up your husband's socks, right?
What I found interesting about that is that the rabbi in the 14th century concluded that there was a personal relationship between a woman and her God. I mean, that's pretty profound, isn't it?
Yes, very good. Good point. Really good point.
Okay, the thing about the scenario about pulling up the socks, it doesn't work for me at least, is that if it's the perfect time to say the Shema, the dude would be saying it and not telling his wife to pull up his socks.
Ah, good point. Good point.
Good point.
Yep.
Why can't you say the Shema while you're pulling up the socks?
Because you're supposed to be focused entirely on this one thing that you're doing. So here's another theory, which is that there's just two approaches, and even the Tanaim have two different approaches. You know, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is a Tana, and going forward, there's a trend towards involving women more, which means finding that they're obligated to things more. So notwithstanding the rule of that Mishnah Kiddushin, we're going to come up with reasons. Women are obligated to read the Megillah, positive time-bound commandment, because they too were part of the miracle of deliverance. They're obligated to drink the 4 cups of wine on Pesach because they too were part of the miracle. So, okay, you've got this thing about the positive time-bound, blah, 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 but these things are apply to women for the same reason they apply to men. Hanukkah, the same thing. Then there's this thing, well, I sort of mentioned this before, sometimes you can't really pick apart the positive and the negative. They're sort of mirror images of each other. If you're bound by the Shabbat restrictions, why wouldn't you be bound by the positive time-bound mitzvot, like saying Kiddush, that relate to Shabbat? If you're obligated not to eat chametz, why wouldn't you be similarly obligated to eat matzah? So Rabbi Judith Hauptman, who was one of the very first women who was admitted to the conservative rabbinate, and she was a professor at JTS, she's saying, look, there's a trend in a more egalitarian direction, at least during the period of the Moraim, which is the Gemara, the Talmud. Of course, this ebbs and flows because later there was much more restrictive outlook on women's roles. But at least in the period of Chazal, there was some bit of conflict between different people during the period of the Tanaim, and there was maybe a trend in the direction of expecting the same out of women as expecting out of men. Rabbi Pamela Barmash was the member of the Conservative Law Committee who wrote a tshuva in 2014, which was adopted by the committee, that said, no, actually women are obligated to every single thing that men are obligated to do, other than things having to do that are restricted by biology, like cutting your beard. And her theory is it wasn't about the children responsibilities, and it wasn't about the pulling up the husband's socks. It was about inferior social status, and it was about, we don't see women participating on the same level as men. And if you take these statements from the Mishnah as descriptive as opposed to prescriptive, then maybe you could say, well, we're living in a different social reality now, and women and men are subject to maybe not the same, maybe it should be more the same than it is, but certainly they have the same opportunities and sometimes the same obligations regarding child rearing and so on. So in those days, the whole class of people, like the whole class of slaves and the whole class of children, they're in a subordinate social role. Women were as well, and now we view the world differently. And so the bottom line here is that we can't imagine that we would be commanded to do something that is morally wrong, and it just seems wrong to have different expectations. Women are human beings and are Jews and free people, and so this is sort of the, I mean, the opinion that she writes has a lot more legal reasoning in it than that, but I think that's the core idea that it all boils down to. I have more to go here, but I think I have to stop because we're out of time. Any last questions or comments?
I just like to comment on the power of prayer. Two things on the just before there's a wedding, marriage ceremony. The Kala is kind of in a state of euphoria, and her soul is open to God. So people come and they ask her for prayers. You know that ceremony, she's sitting there and people come up to her, i.e. women come up to her and ask for blessing for other people or for whatever. So she's in this kind of, the idea of one person is like empowered for those few minutes just before she gets married with that power of a oneness with God to ask for healing or whatever. The other one is that initially the decree for the Jews in Egypt was like longer than it was. It was supposed to be 400 and something years. It was like 300 and something years, whatever. And it was because all of Israel cried out to Hashem saying, you know, we're enslaved and our lives are miserable. Get us out of this place. So the idea of a community prayer of the Jews in Egypt influenced God's decree on them.
And even among a non-Jewish character in the Bible, right? Hagar prays for Ishmael, her son, right? And then she comes across the water bottle that, or the source of water that saves them. Yeah, that's a great point. So anyway, thank you all. This has been a lot of fun, and I hope we get more chances to study together. And
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I learned a
Thank you,
lot. I
David.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
So much. You're a wonderful teacher, David.
Thank you.
That's right. He is.
Let me make the closing remarks. I think David wanted an interactive class and he got it. David was the leader of the class, but I think the whole class was teaching each other and learning from each other. It was a very pleasant experience. There's a lot of nice things in the chat, and unless someone has a problem with it, I'm going to put the chat also as materials from the class, and I'll refer to it in the email. One further remark, this is the second class we've had about religious text. We had a class of 4 sessions about 2 months ago on Pirkei Avot, and then in May we're going to have a class about a new book that a friend of mine has put out, also about Pirkei Avot. And later on in the fall, we may have another class on Pirkei Avot from him. And we also may have some classes on the Psalms. So you all will be getting more or less a weekly email from us. And you might find some more interesting classes about religious text, as well as a lot of other things. So thank you, David, very much. It was a great class, very interactive, very informative, and everybody in the class was so active and so informed. It was a wonderful experience.
Yes, thanks to all of you. And Jerry, thank you so much for all the organizational work and publicity, and it really works out great here. So very great. And I've learned a lot from you all. So
Thank you. Thank you.
thank you.
I'm
Bye-bye.
closing off now. Bye-bye, everyone.